Our speaker this evening is Kathleen Kaveny, Darrell and Juliet Libby Millennium Professor at Boston College. And once again, our topic tonight is LGBTQ students in Catholic schools. Is there a way forward?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. If you'd ever met me, you knew the reason that I was in school all the time at Yale is that nobody is going to, or even then, was going to make me the center of a basketball team or even any kind of player on the local pickup baseball team. So I had to find something else to do with my time that was constructive, since those opportunities were closed to me. But thank you very much to Father John and all of you for having me have a conversation with you tonight. And as you've said, the topic of my talk is LGBTQ students in Catholic schools. Is there a way forward? Now, we decided on this topic last fall, which was a general topic, and which now seems to me to be a very long time ago. I had a pretty clear and frankly kind of narrow idea for the talk. It was going to focus on specific incidents that had been recently in the news. In 2019, Braybrook Preparatory School, a Jesuit high school in Indiana, refused to fire a teacher in a same-sex marriage. And after extensive negotiations, the Archbishop of Indianapolis stripped the school of its identity as a Catholic institution. So that had happened, but another school in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, Cathedral High School, complied with the Archdiocese to demand the firing of a faculty member in a same-sex marriage. And Indiana Supreme Court in September 22 unanimously upheld its right to do so. In June 2022, in my own area, Bishop Robert McManus stripped a Jesuit middle school for disadvantaged boys of its official Catholic status after the institution flew flags representing the Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ pride movements. So there were a lot of institutions going on, issues going on of this sort, and I thought originally I would look at this from the perspective of one of my hats, which is a law and religion hat. But as I thought about the talk more recently, it seemed to me something else was more important. When I originally thought about what I would say to you today, it seems like a very long time ago. The context has changed a great deal in the past year in terms of theology, ecclesial sociology, and particular urgency. Because that context has changed, in my view, it is essential to try to understand different theological Catholic perspectives or sensibilities, if you will, on the question from the inside, so to speak. That doesn't mean that you can't think one is right and one is wrong, and that you can't judge that the practical consequences of one or the other approach is truly harmful. But it does mean that you have to try to understand those who disagree with you sympathetically. So rather than coming at this talk from the perspective of my hat as a law and religion scholar, I'm coming at it more from my hat as somebody who wrote a book called Prophecy Without Contempt, which is a book that tries to figure out how we can talk to one another, disagree with one another, try to persuade one another without utterly breaking relationships with one another, even on very controversial issues. So I think in a nutshell that this means asking 3 questions in trying to understand people who disagree with you. First, what are they trying to protect? Second, what are they most afraid of? And third, what distortions are their characteristic dangers? And then I think you have to ask those questions of your own position as well. Third, because we are called to be Catholic, to remain together as one family despite our disagreements, I think we need to kind of develop new ways to accommodate our differences within a fundamental unity. And I have a proposal for that toward the end, which is actually drawn from the legal realm, the law of diplomacy. So what I'm going to do is look at these 3 points in more detail in the remainder of the talk. I'm going to kind of talk about changing contexts. Secondly, I'm going to talk about 2 basic views, worldviews, sensibilities that I think are orienting people's different perspectives on these issues. And third, I'm going to propose propose is a little too strong a word. I'm going to articulate a different way of thinking about living with differences. So that's what I'm about in this talk. So as I said, in the year or so since I accepted this invitation and the 6 months since I kind of gave a topic, the broader context has sharpened and changed in 3 respects: the theological context, the sociological context, and the political context. And I think these changes have sharpened some of the anguish that people feel about these issues. Let's start with the theological context. Since I accepted the invitation for this talk, we have received several key documents from the Vatican, as well as gestures from the Pope himself, and then backlash to the documents and gestures, which puts us in a situation where people feel, frankly, a little bit of whiplash. In December 2023, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith issued the declaration Fiducia Supplicans on the pastoral meaning of blessings, which allowed for the possibility of informal blessings of people in irregular sexual relationships and people in same-sex partnerships. But less than 4 months later, in April 2024, the very same dicastery issued another declaration that seemed very different in tone, at least. It was called Dignitatis Infinita, which rejects gender ideology and, along with desiring a personal self-determination as gender theory prescribes, that's a quotation, as, quote, a concession to the age-old temptation to make oneself God, entering into competition with the true God of love revealed to us in the gospel. So you've got these 2 documents that nobody seems to quite know what to do with in order to reconcile. But even after that second document, Dignitatis Infinita, the Pope has taken actions, and so has the dicastery itself, that seem to qualify some of the material in Dignitatis Infinita. In November 2023, the dicastery that issued that document affirmed that transgender people can be baptized, serve as godparents, and even be official witnesses to Catholic weddings. More recently, in a response to a letter from Sister Janine Gromnick, who has all long ministered to LGBTQ people, the Pope affirmed that, quote, gender ideology is something other than homosexual or transsexual people. Gender ideology makes everyone equal without respect for personal history. I understand the concern about that paragraph in Dignitatis Infinita, but it refers not to transgender people, but to gender ideology, which nullifies differences. Transgender people must be accepted and integrated into society. And just this past week, the Washington Post published a very moving story about the conversations and even friendship between members of the transgender community in Rome on the one hand and Pope Francis on the other. So it's clear that we've got some recent documents that are not totally able to be reconciled without a little bit of creativity. I'm not saying it can be done, but it's not obvious. Second, we have an ecclesial context in the Catholic Church that is quite complicated and quite divided. It has been anecdotally obvious for a while, but it is now undeniable that there is a widening gap between the view of American clergy and the people in the pews on a number of issues. A November 2023 report released by the Catholic Project, an initiative from the Catholic University of America, reported on the largest survey of priests in 50 years. With respect to theology and doctrine, younger priests are far more likely to describe themselves as conservative/orthodox or very conservative/orthodox, as opposed to very progressive, somewhat progressive, or even middle of the road, according to the report. Quote, more than half of the priests who were ordained since 2010 see themselves on the conservative side of the scale, said the report. No surveyed priests who were ordained after 2020 described themselves as very progressive. Now, their congregations may not feel the same way, at least with respect to same-sex marriage, for example. In 2022, a Gallup poll showed 71% of the population supported same-sex marriage. And a 2019 survey by the Pew Research Center revealed that 61% of Catholics thought that same-sex couples should be able to marry. But then, who counts as Catholics? Who counts as the congregation? A recent AP article titled "A Step Back in Time, America's Catholic Church Sees an Immense Shift Toward the Old Ways" suggests that younger Catholics who actively participate in their faith may have more in common with their conservative priests than with their secular counterparts. This line from that report struck me as salient. Even today, surveys show that most American Catholics are far from Orthodox. Most support abortion rights. The vast majority use birth control. But increasingly, those Catholics are not in church. According to the survey, only 9% of millennial Catholics attend church on a weekly basis. So that's the theological context, a little bit of a snapshot of the ecclesial context. And now I want to talk about the political context in the United States. As it turns out, the division around, say, same-sex marriage tracks political divisions. A 2023 Gallup poll showed that 64% of Americans called same-sex relationships acceptable. That sounds like a lot, but it's down 7 points, 10% from 71% in 2022. Republicans saying they found same-sex relationships acceptable dipped over the last year by over 20%, from 56% to 41%, larger than the dip among Democrats from 85% to 79%. Independents stayed largely the same, which I thought was interesting. 72% found same-sex marriage acceptable in 2022, and 73% say they do now. And Catholics are deeply politically divided, but they clearly lean Republican, according to a Pew Research Center report issued in April 2024. Only 44% of Catholics are Democrat or lead Democrat, while 52% are Republican or lean Republican. Among white Catholics, the numbers are even starker. 37% of white Catholics tend toward the Democratic Party, while 61% lean toward Republicans. The percentages are reversed with respect to Hispanic Catholics, though that may be changing. If the election were held today, 43% of Catholics said they would likely vote for Biden, 55% they would likely vote for Trump. This is very significant in my view, because Trump delivered, after all, on the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was the main priority of the Bishops' Conference for the past nearly 50 years. And the originalist philosophy that doomed that decision is, on its own terms, although some of the justice would quibble about it, equally lethal, in my view, to Obergefell versus Hobbes, the 215th decision that gave constitutional protection to same-sex marriage. So what? You may ask why I think those changes are relevant and what in the world they're relevant to. What's the upshot? First, I think it shows that the divisions over sexual morality, including the status of LGBTQ relationships, are not going to go away in the church anytime soon. Second, from a purely pragmatic perspective, reading one another out of the church is not the best way to proceed. We will simply shrink even further numbers that are already shrinking. See how they love one another, despite their differences, is a recipe for evangelization. See how they annihilate one another on Twitter, now X, is not. Third, I think this means that it is incumbent upon us, as much as possible, to see those who disagree with us as articulating an acceptably Catholic position in the church here and now, even if it is one that we hope does not prevail in the long run, because we see that it is harmful to both individuals and the common good. So this is a very uncomfortable position I'm advocating. I'm saying that people on both sides, people in this room, see the opposite position on LGBTQ rights as unjust, as harmful, and as something that needs to disappear. That has to be held in tension, I think, with the view that we need to work it out together as members of the same body of Christ. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to see one another as reasonable, if wrong, in some basic sense? Well, I think the first way to approach this question is to understand the different views, not narrowly as holding simply a position on LGBTQ rights or sexual ethics, but as holding that position as part of a broader way of framing. I think in the United States today, there are two basic frames organizing the way Catholics experience the relationship of their faith with the broader of culture. I'm going to call one the culture of distinctiveness and the second the culture of encounter. Let me just quickly explain them as an overview, and I'll dig into them a little bit more later on. So the culture of distinctiveness is what I call the first culture I'm going to talk about. As the name suggests, it prioritizes the ways in which the Catholic faith is different from the commitments of the broader culture. Liturgically, it sees the church as offering a transcendent vision of the universe that contrasts sharply with the imminent, practical, quotidian, and messy concerns of day-to-day life. Morally, it sees the church as offering a view of human flourishing that contradicts the dominant emphasis of liberal secular society on self-fulfillment and pleasure. The culture of distinctness, which I associate primarily with the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, itself developed as a reaction to what I call the culture of openness that characterized the period immediately after the Second Vatican Council. And we can talk about why. I've got some views on that, but I'm not going to go into that here. The second culture I call the culture of encounter. As the name suggests, it calls for Catholics to extend themselves, beyond their communities, beyond their comfort zones, to meet other human beings where they are, no matter what their religion or their life situation. Liturgically, it promotes simplicity, praise of God, and inclusivity. Morally, this approach prioritizes an empathetic engagement with particular human beings, no matter what their state in life or closeness or distance from the official church or its teaching. This theme of encounter is one that has been heavily emphasized in the pontificate of Pope Francis. A 2015 article in the Houston Catholic Worker, written by Thomas Eggleston, helpfully unpacks Francis' notion of the culture of encounter, taking care to situate it in its original Latin American context. Drawing on the philosopher Enrique Dussel, Eggleston writes, "To encounter a living, breathing friend, to embrace a child, or to share a meal with a hungry person is to have an experience which is in essence the way in which we encounter the intangible and invisible God." The culture of encounter worries about moral issues too, but focuses primarily upon those raised by global capitalism. It worries about the tendency to think of people in terms of their monetary value and usefulness, because that tendency gives rise to a throwaway culture that defaces the inalienable dignity of the people that don't fit in, the outcast, the poor, the marginalized. So that's a big overview of, on the one hand, the culture of identity, and on the other hand, the culture of encounter. I'd like now to begin identifying what I said that we needed to talk about, the hopes, the fears, and the dangers of both the culture of identity and the culture of encounter with respect to the way they treat LGBTQ issues. Now, there are a number of ways to go about this, but I think a little closer examination of some of the issues around the Brayburf Jesuit Preparatory School is a good way to focus things. As I described at the beginning, Brayburf refused to fire a teacher in a same-sex marriage, same-sex relationship. And as a result of that, it lost its official Catholic status. In a canonical decree effective June 21st, 2019, Archbishop Charles Thompson declared, quote, that the institution known as Brayburf Jesuit Preparatory School can no longer use the name Catholic and will no longer be identified or recognized as a Catholic institution by the Archbishop or by the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. Well, what caused the Archbishop to cut ties with Brayburf, one of the most distinguished Catholic high schools in the United States? As I said, the school's leadership refused to terminate the employment of an openly gay teacher who had entered into a civil marriage with a person of the same sex. Archbishop Thompson's views, I think, exemplifies some of the fears, concerns, and dangers of the culture of identity, while the Jesuits' approach exemplifies some of the fears, hopes, and dangers associated with the culture of encounter. So let's back up a minute and briefly review how the situation came about. In 2017, the Archdiocese became aware that both members of a civilly married same-sex couple were teaching at different Catholic schools within its purview. It ordered both schools to refuse to renew the teachers' employment contracts. While one school, Cathedral High School, complied with the order, the other, Brayburf, did not. 2 years of negotiations resulted in an impasse. This was not done immediately. In its statement to the Brayburf Jesuit community, the school administration of the school raised 2 key points about separation from the Archdiocese. The first was a matter of protecting a legitimate sphere of authority over the internal life of the school. It was a Jesuit school. They had a legitimate sphere of authority. The second assertion asserted a claim of conscience in exercising that authority in refusing to fire the teacher. While conceptually distinct, the Jesuit viewed these 2 points as intertwined. Their statement noted, quote, "After long and prayerful consideration, we determined that following the Archdiocese directive would not only violate our informed conscience on this particular matter, but also set a concerning precedent for future interference in the school's operation and other governance matters that Brayburf Jesuit leadership has historically had the sole right and privilege to address and decide." But the Archdiocese also invoked a combination of conscientious decision-making and role-related responsibility in justifying the decision to strip Brayburf of its official Catholic identity. Archbishop Thompson clearly viewed his decision as entailed by his fiduciary duty to the diocese. He said, "I'm a sinner too. I don't have all the perfect answers. My goal is not to carry out Chuck Thompson's vision or Chuck Thompson's teachings. I've been entrusted with the care of souls in central and southern Indiana, and I've been entrusted to do that and to use as my markers the teachings of the church." So how are we going to think about these? The two consciences, the two readings of the teachers of the teachings of the church. I think the differences in conscience go back to differences between the priorities of the culture of distinctness on the one hand and the culture of encounter on the other, as they sort themselves out on the issue of LGBTQ issues. Let's look first at the culture of distinctness. In my view, Archbishop Thompson has no particular animus against the teachers themselves who are in same-sex marriages. But he believes that the primary task of a Catholic institution is to proclaim official Catholic moral teaching in a clear and unambiguous way, particularly against the overwhelming counter-witness of a secular culture. I see this stance, this concern, as exemplifying the culture of distinctness. In this view, as I read Archbishop Thompson, but also other people who take this view, the major task of the church is to promote a culture of life in opposition to the culture of death, which entails taking a firm stance not only against abortion, but also against same-sex marriage and gender ideology, whatever that means, because they all threaten the traditional family, which they believe is the best context for life to be nurtured. The task of Catholic institutions, including Catholic schools, is to offer a prophetic, countercultural, and courageous stand on these matters. From this perspective, recent Supreme Court decisions protecting religious liberty make such a stand possible as well as necessary. So that's the stance. What are the hopes behind it? Well, with respect to sexual ethics, I think the culture of distinctness sees itself as upholding an older and threatened view of sexual morality that sees sex as oriented not primarily toward individual fulfillment, but toward the good of the family and the good of the species. To put it in a nutshell, on this view, sexual activity requires sacrifice from everyone, not just LGBTQ people. Married folk are not to use artificial contraception. Single folk of any stripe are not to have sexual relations. Marriage is not primarily a romantic partnership or even an emotional affinity, but primarily a vehicle for the orderly regulation of children and family. Now, this may sound strange to our ears, but it is not a strange view. In fact, it was the larger public view for quite a long time, as the historian from Harvard, Nancy Cott, outlines in her magnificent book, Public Vows, which traces the evolution of the meaning of marriage, both in religion and in secular circles. With respect to Catholic schools, then, the aim is to provide an oasis of Catholic values, of order, within what they perceive as a larger hostile culture, particularly around sexual issues. Children, ideally, should perceive monogamous, lifelong, big heterosexual families as ordinary, normal, and norming, and should not encounter serious challenges to that view until they are socialized sufficiently well within a Catholic view of flourishing. So those are the hopes. What are the fears? I think they're threefold. First, I think, is a fear of Catholic assimilation into a hostile, liberal, individualist culture. Second is the fear that key elements of a Catholic worldview, its orientation toward the transcendence, a prioritization of a particular view of communal flourishing that depends on sexual discipline, are losing their intelligibility, let alone their credibility in the broader culture. Third, I think, is a fear that the moral values around which they've organized their lives, which they believe to be perennially true, are under attack both within the church and with the culture. So they fear attack as well. What then is the characteristic danger of the culture of distinctness? In my view, Pope Francis has emphasized this quite a lot. The culture of distinctness risks falling prey into a certain kind of moral and spiritual pride in which one's achievements are centered. And that type of pride is inconsistent with all of our dependence on God's grace and forgiveness. There is a sort of operational Pelagianism operating upon many in this framework. It's as if God's grace is available as sort of like heavenly gas pumps, the sacraments, and you put the God's grace in your car and you drive yourself to heaven. In our Instagram age, this can lead to a kind of self-vaunting. Perusing the website of a certain Catholic conservative publication, I just saw a story about a Catholic scholar, a brilliant mother of many. The story was illustrated by a beautiful, gauzy photograph of the scholar holding a brand new baby at home in bed, her 7th or 8th maybe. It was apparently taken by a professional photographer, if you look at the sign on the picture. Well, good for her. But is that photo, is that Instagram to inspire people or to compete with them? And how do we know the difference? So that's what I see as the center framework of the culture of distinctness, sometimes called the culture of identity. What about the culture of encounter in LGBTQ issues? The Jesuits who refused to fire the same-sex teacher at Brayburf were not selling out Catholic teaching. They were coming at the problem, in my view, from the perspective of the culture of encounter. They can point out, and they did point out, that other moral teachings are in play in the decision too, particularly the equal dignity of LGBTQ persons. They are not to be demeaned, shunned, or rejected. And this teaching, in their view, arguably needs to take precedence in high schools when young persons are at their most fragile. No LGBTQ person should be expelled from their community. And no LGBTQ student should see an LGBTQ person expelled from their community either. Terminating the employment of the teacher looks very much like an expulsion. From the perspective of LGBTQ students, it would feel like a personal assault. The Jesuits can quote Pope Francis, who has said, "Homosexuals have a right to be part of the family." Quoting, "They're children of God and have a right to a family. Nobody should be thrown out or made miserable because of that." That's a very strong statement. So what are the hopes of the culture of encounter with respect to LGBTQ issues? First, I think the culture of encounter hopes that the church can bring the radical message of the unconditional and faithful love of God to each and every human person. LGBTQ people are made by God and loved by God in all their uniqueness. Secondly, and consequently, the culture of encounter prioritizes tenderness over purity. The church is a field hospital where we care for one another's wounds. The sufferings and the hopes and dreams of LGBTQ students are part of the sufferings and hopes and dreams of humanity, and the church should not treat them as either foreign or threatening. Third, the culture of encounter emphasizes the mercy of God as the context for understanding justice. Especially with young people, the priority is emphasizing love, connection, and reconciliation, not ostracization and judgment. So those, I think, are the hopes of the culture of encounter. Needless to say, some people within it hope for development of doctrine on church teaching on this issue, just as people in the culture of distinctness hope that traditional teaching will be reaffirmed. But I don't think that those are the primary issues. I think it is this way of envisioning the church that situates the other. So what are the fears of the culture of encounter? Well, I think the first fear is ecclesial. I think the fear is that the church will turn in on itself, becoming a sort of nostalgic reenactor rather than doing the hard work of bringing good news to the people. Second, I think the culture of encounter worries about the way the culture of life versus the culture of death dichotomy has rolled itself out, at least in the US. It tends to separate people into us, the perfect, the holy, and them, the disordered and the damned. Heterosexuals, in particular, tend to excuse their own sexual peccadillos while exaggerating those of LGBTQ people. And third, I think the culture of encounter worries that the church is not open to the greater unfolding of insights into what it means and does not mean to be a follower of Christ. It freezes the tradition and God's freedom at a particular point in time. So those are the fears of the culture of encounter. What is its characteristic danger or dangers? Well, I think there are several, just like there are several with the culture of distinctness. But two, I think, are identified by its opponents. And I think our opponents identify our dangers in each case better than anyone else. First, the pressure of American perfectionism can be tempting for everyone. But the point of Pope Francis' accompaniment is not that everyone, even LGBTQ folk, should have their fabulous Instagram feed, because they can be morally perfect too. The point is that none of us at all, including but not limited to LGBTQ folk, are morally perfect, and we all stand in great need of the merciful tenderness of Christ. In short, and in a nutshell, in Pope Francis's culture of encounter, nobody gets a fabulous Instagram feed. Second, the notion of pastoral accompaniment, so powerful in the culture of encounter, can seem untethered from a substantive goal or structure. Where are we going when we accompany people? Is the goal merely individual, or is there a communal shape to it? How do we articulate that, balancing, integrating personal experience and the wisdom of tradition? It's not clear from some of the Pope's remarks. Finally, I want to add my own point, wearing my hat as a moral theologian. I worry that the overwhelming emphasis on pastoral accompaniment has deterred the hard work of actually developing moral doctrine. Unlike many moralists of my generation and younger, I do think there is a place for a renewed and reformed casuistry, provided it's not rigid and totalizing. So I think we need to do the hard work of updating the casuistry, the Catholic moral theology in the books, to be consistent with and illuminating of pastoral advice. You can do that in a couple of ways. First, you can propose an entirely new framework. I think Margaret Farley did that in her book, Just Love. Or second, you can try to work with to develop the traditional categories, which I believe will in some point need to be done. I am not as down on the traditional categories of object, circumstance, and end, that you use to analyze moral acts as some people are, in part because those categories, which go back to Aristotelian act analysis, are actually in the criminal law. They're all over the Western tradition, and they can be helpful, provided they're not interpreted in a rigid manner. Where could there be some development? Well, for example, the tradition has long held that there is no what's called parvity of matter in sexual sin. So, as a theoretical point, all sexual sin was of the matter that could be mortal sin, that could cut you off from God forever. I think Pope Francis's magisterium suggests, it doesn't make the argument, but suggests that this is not the case. People in committed same-sex relationships, people who have, are in irregular relationships of opposite sex are not the walking eternally dead. Far from it. I think we know that, but I think the moral theology needs to, many people, figure out a way to propose this in a rigorous fashion and subject it to testing. So, is there a way forward? I've spent a great deal of time doing several things, talking about the culture, talking about the church, talking about two different ways of thinking about distinctiveness and encounter. The upshot of the exercise has been to provide a solid basis for what you might otherwise consider a trivial recommendation. I want to suggest that at this point in time, both the culture of distinctness and the culture of encounter have a place within the broader Catholic tradition. The next question is, what does that mean institutionally? How should bishops and archbishops who identify with the culture of distinctiveness deal with schools run by religious orders like the Jesuits, who take more of a culture of encounter stance on LGBTQ issues at Catholic schools? Conversely, how should bishops and archbishops who identify with the culture of encounter deal with schools that emphasize distinctiveness? I would like to suggest an imaginative approach that takes seriously the notion that Catholicism is a big and internally pluralistic world, not a small, uniform club. And I would like to suggest that the ordinaries who run the diocese that form the constituent bodies of that world cannot take an isolationist perspective. They need to find a way to take responsibility for their diocese, but not rule out legitimate pluralism. And I'll start with, say, pluralism of religious orders, because this is a little bit easier to justify. A helpful analogy here might be the status of embassies in foreign lands. In contrast to popular conceptions, the land that an embassy sits on does remain part of the territory of the host country under international law. So the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. is part of the United States in certain key respects. Nonetheless, its walls define a protected sphere that cannot be entered by anyone without the permission of the ambassador. What happens within those walls is under the authority of the visiting community, not that of the host country. The overarching purpose of the rules of diplomatic immunity, for example, is not to allow foreign diplomats to get away with violations of the law. As a State Department brochure states, the purpose of these privileges and immunities is not to benefit individuals, but to ensure the efficient and effective performance of their official missions on behalf of their governments. A key aspect of that purpose is to maintain personal relationships, as well as to increase mutual understanding, despite significant differences. Without the strong and reciprocal rules of diplomatic law, relations between countries would need to be conducted at a safe distance. Because of those rules, representatives even of warring countries can build connections that facilitate better understanding and respect. Moreover, the diplomatic framework that even friendly countries use to preserve autonomy while building closer relations is important. Its overarching purpose is to foster unity within the human family while taking account of difference. I think we need that kind of framework to think about connection, difference, and autonomy within the Balkanized Catholic world, especially in the US. So I would like to make a suggestion. I think the Archbishop of Indianapolis might have profitably and coherently viewed Jesuit high schools in his archdiocese as something like embassies in his jurisdiction from, say, a different country, a different realm in the broad Catholic world. On my view, an archbishop might expect his culture of distinctness role to be implemented within schools under his direct jurisdiction. That may be part of what it means to be the local ordinary. But he ought not to insist that schools run by other ecclesiastical entities in the church comply with his directives, provided that their approach is credibly represented by other constituencies within the broader church community. The Jesuits may have a different approach to the admittedly difficult problem of same-sex teaching, couples teaching in Catholic schools, or expressing solidarity and accompaniment with LGBTQ students. But their different approach of encounter no more wrongfully impedes his own conscientious judgment than does the different liberal approach of a neighboring archdiocese. By allowing Jesuits some autonomy within their sphere, he can maintain connections with them, and through them with a substantial number of people in the Catholic Church he might not otherwise reach. In the realm of international law, this is called diplomacy. In the realm of theology, I believe it is a prerequisite to Christian unity and even to evangelization. But the diplomatic accommodation has to run both ways. If the shoe is on the other foot, bishops representing the culture of encounter are to strive to accommodate those who resonate with the culture of identity within their midst. So I would also say that Cardinal Cupich ought to allow the same internal autonomy to an Opus Dei high school under his jurisdiction that Archbishop Thompson should allow to a Jesuit school under his. So that's my suggestion. Now, needless to say, my approach isn't going to satisfy activists on either side who wish the opposition would magically concede or dematerialize. But I think we need to take a longer view. I think that the church is in the middle of a great informal synod on sexual morality, where it is struggling to decide whether and to what degree to develop its teaching on the matter. This struggle is not new. In some ways, it started at the time of Casti Connubii, continued with Humanae Vitae, and is now focused on LGBTQ issues. Actually, in both of those encyclicals, doctrine was developed, although not as far as some people wanted. And my own theoretical interest really is the development of moral doctrine, and to have it proceed authentically, the whole church needs to be in conversation, including people who disagree with one another. John Courtney Murray needed, for example, to grapple with the best arguments claiming that religious freedom would lead to religious indifferentism, and he did that. But the challenges of his critics sharpened his argument and the Catholic position itself. In our own day, I think for sexual morality doctrine to develop authentically, we can't eliminate one part of the discussion. Why not? Well, I think we need to rethink and broaden our notion of the two goods of marriage, originally called fides and proles, fidelity and fruitfulness. There will be pushback, and that is good. We need to speak to the adherents of both the culture of distinctness and the culture of encounter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen, for your thoughtful and challenging presentation. We're going to turn to questions and discussion.
I was a chaplain at Cathedral High School from 1970 to 1973.
You're kidding.
I often visited Father O'Brien and his fellow Jesuits at Roubar High School on 86th Street. If I were chaplain today at Cathedral, I don't know what I would be doing.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, the canonical issues in all this are very complicated. And one of the reasons that Cathedral, I think, gave in is because it received a lot of financial support from the archdiocese. Whereas Brebeuf, because I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I'm pronouncing it like the name of the saint, and I can't get it out of my head.
Brebeuf is the way they pronounce it. Brebeuf.
Okay, Brebeuf. It's a buff Bray. Okay. They they had financial means, and that's a factor in all of this.
Go ahead.
Kathleen, when I was in seminary, most of the sexual morality that was taught was based on Aquinas, who based his thinking on Aristotle. And Aristotle based sexuality as an animal function in terms of the evolution of things. Vatican II changed that a bit in that marriage was meant to be for both procreation and intimacy and fruitfulness. Has theology moved beyond that? And has any official teaching of the church allowed us to expand from that?
Well, I think you've got to look at the way it's even expanded and see and really, kind of push back against the notion that church teaching doesn't expand on sexual ethics. And so even Casti Connubii, Pope Pius, which reaffirmed the prohibition against contraception and against abortion. Everybody's like, oh, well, it reaffirmed that. Yeah, it did. But it also did something that was extremely important, right? It interpreted, it said prolase or procreation was the most important good, and that fides, was the secondary good, but it interpreted fides in a broader way. Earlier on in the tradition, it was much more like, taming sexual desire. So you'd only have sexual relationships in marriage. But in Casti Connubii, you have a development toward recognizing that fides had a positive value, love, intimacy, mutual support, not simply, a restraining value. That was expanded even in Humanae Vitae, where the two goals of marriage were put on the same level. So that fides was as important as prolase. It wasn't a secondary goal that you kind of got along the way. So you had that kind of development. I think that, there was a lot of development in the birth control commission that recommended the changing of the position on that. But as you know, a lot of the discussion was shut down, when Father Curran was silenced. My teacher, Margaret Farley, was silenced, and so people just stopped, I think, working in that area. And so you've had a lot of work on the pastoral side, which is the accompaniment. Oh, we're not changing church teaching. But nobody is really, I think, going back to looking at the teaching now in a way that, isn't just a totally different framework. And I think if you're going to, part of the responsibility of the tradition is to look at, well, how do we see the goals of sexuality? And, are there things that are in line with this? We can expand that. But then I think there are things you can say a hard no to. And I'll give you an example of my hard no. I read a story about how young people in the New York Times, are choking one another in their sexual relationships. They're engaged in the practice of choking. This is something that came from porn to the internet and is now in real life. I think we can develop a Catholic sexual ethics that recognizes the difference between behavior like that and committed same-sex relationships based on love and commitment, So, but we have to, it isn't just consent, right? It's commitment, fides, and a kind of fruitfulness. That would be how the development would have to take place if it were going to take place.
Thank you.
There is a comment in chat. Is your proposed solution of embassies realistic in the light of the Hosanna Tabor decision, which grants authority to local bishops to impose uniformity in terms of adherence to doctrinal issues by faculty and administrators now considered to be ministers?
Yeah, I mean, Hosanna Tabor gave a huge amount of power to churches and church-affiliated institutions to escape the consequences of the ordinary anti-discrimination law. So my point would be to say to to Archbishop Thompson and people like that, but also to Cardinal Cupich, if he were setting down an Opus Dei school, you don't have to think in those terms. You don't have to, your job doesn't mean you have to ensure uniformity, even if you have a power to do that. You can think of yourself as allowing a legitimate diversity of opinions. And well, why is it legitimate? Well, that's why I developed these two frames for looking at things. I'm not just using the word accompany, right? I mean, which is a nice word, but I'm trying to develop a way of framing both of these approaches that, that can make sense on a more robust theological platform.
Thank you. Thank you. And Kiefer has a question.
I hope I can get the question out quickly. I'd just like to talk a little bit about where it's coming from. I guess I would call myself Team Encounter. And I've worked a little bit with activism for the LGBTQ plus community. And when I think about what we've talked about a way forward, and we've talked about two different cultures, the whole discussion brought to mind Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail and his plea to not make Black people wait any longer. That when we have our discussions between the two cultures, we're talking about a community of folks who are suffering ostracism and unwelcome, not just from the Catholic Church, but from secular institutions. They have struggled for civil rights. They are under threat of losing those. And I really enjoyed hearing your description of a way forward and the analogy to embassies and diplomacy and another perspective. But I worry, and I have to remember, that the church moves very slowly. Will this make us stick in a static position, more of a détente than a move forward? Should the discussion always be with LGBTQ plus folks here and we discuss them instead of saying, we should never have these discussions without the folks for whom this whole thing revolves around?
I think Pope Francis recognizes the need to have inclusive discussions. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I guess what I want to suggest, is that moving the church forward on anything is not an easy process. It's just not. If you look at the struggle on usury, if you look at the struggle on religious liberty, you can wish it were faster. Politically, the whole burden of the first part of this talk was to suggest that things are changing, and it isn't necessarily moving in the direction that the culture of encounter would like with respect to the demographics in the country and the church. So there's a pragmatic reason to do this, but I think there's also a theological reason. I think there are all sorts of justifications for a new position, right? You could justify religious liberty, for all sorts of reasons. And one was, there is no moral truth, right? But John Courtney Murray couldn't accept that because that's not consistent with with the whole idea that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light. So he had to find a theological way to do this that was an authentic development of the tradition. And the only way he could do this was if he fought the best arguments on the other side. So I think we are still struggling to articulate a sexual ethic that will have a broader view of fides and proles, but isn't going to justify, and, I call me old, call me just, puritanical, I got a hard pass on having teenagers choke one another. So, what is the ethic that we come up with for that? We all know that that's not the same thing. We all know in our intuition that that's not the same thing. We all know, couples that aren't doing that. But the point of theology is to give a reflection of what we know. It can't just be, well, I don't think it's the same thing, and I know it's not the same thing, because that's not going to help in the long run. So what do we say about sexual ethics? Do we have, do we extend it to polyamory? Do we, how do we think about commitment? Can commitment be expanded or not? There's just a huge amount of issues that have to be thought through.
Lois, I have a question that I tried to raise my hand, but that may set up a couple of the ones that are in the chat.
Okay.
This is prejudice and react against it, but when it's, especially in this diocese, but in many parts of the church, it seems like questions about LGBTQ or synodality or any of the more progressive issues get a lot of pushback from two massively powerful groups, the wealthy and folks that are kind of tied to a clerical style that's very heavily top down. And to have an embassy indicates some degree of a willingness to recognize that you're not perfect. And I don't know if I see that that's the case.
Well, that I think is an important issue, because I think that is the big problem that Pope Francis identifies with, not just the culture of distinctness, but frankly with Americans anyway, right? We all want to be fabulous and on Instagram, and Pope Francis is challenging all of us to say, the church is messy. You are messy. I don't care how good you look on.
You just put mute.
You are a sinner in need of God's grace, and that should be your identity, somebody who is grateful for God's mercy. So what unites us is much more important than what divides us. That I think is the main thing. And there's a solid ground for pushing this in, for articulating this from a deep theological perspective. It's not shoddy. Now, I think in order to understand the culture of identityness, you have to see a little bit what people want. So I was born, I don't remember the Second Vatican Council. I did not go to, I went to public schools for a couple of years before it shut down. So I don't have Catholicism in my bones the way my parents did, right? So I was looking not for release from rules, but for some organization, for some way of framing the world, that I didn't get in the secular culture in the tumult of the 70s. And I think this is even truer of the younger people that are more conservative. They are in a world that has no norms. They are already in that world. They don't need to be told they can do whatever they want. They are already doing that. Some of them are looking for structure and order. So I think part of the job of older culture of encounter people is to encounter the people that are lost, that are looking for structure, that aren't looking for that aren't looking for a kind of, release from oppression in some ways. Even LGBTQ students want to find a way to be in the order of the church that can encompass them too, right?
There's a specific question in chat. Would you extend your analogy to individual parishes so that possibly two pastors in neighboring parishes might come to different decisions in a given situation?
I would like to do that. I mean, I'd like to see this model of seeing other Catholics not as, the enemy, as benighted, as cruel. I mean, although some are, or as loosey-goosey and just open to anything that's a fad, although I'm sure some are, but as saying that in the main, these two approaches represent legitimate articulations, legitimate styles of being Catholic. So it may not be what you think is the most important, but it's serving a group of people who would otherwise not have a home in the church. Now, is that totally just? No, I mean, it isn't. But it's also not just about women. It's not just, but for some reason, even if you think things should change, you're staying with the church, because where else would you go, in a sense, And I understand people, become Episcopalian. I'm talking about the broader church and some. I don't. But if you feel a call to stay and help build the body of Christ, help feed the body of Christ, it's always been tough. It's always been tough.
I'd like to put together to the last two. I think we have time for one more question. One person commented that, so I think my conclusion might be that from this discussion, that there is not a way forward for our LGBTQ students in our Catholic elementary or high school. Do you agree? And then a second comment or question, do you have any practical advice for teachers and students who are living with the reality of LGBTQ identities in dioceses that are not supporting cultures of encounter?
Well, I don't want to say there is no way forward. I mean, you've got a pope who's open to this. You've got a pope who's inaugurated a new style. And I think that what has to be put forward, on the part of liberals with the same, energy that the conservatives do, is not just, little remarks, and I don't mean little, but, about accompaniment. This is a whole vision of what the church should be. And it's totally legitimate. And, maybe there's another way of doing it, but we've got a basis for arguing for places. So I think that's some help, but I think you have to make the bigger case. I think you can't just make a piecemeal case.
And the second part of the question, or the other question, any advice for teachers or students in schools where the diocese may not be leaning toward encounter?
Well, I mean, I think I don't have any practical advice because I don't know that particular environment, but I think that the more you can do to resist the framing of this as a culture war, where one side is on one side of the culture war and the other is on the other side of the culture war, and instead reframe it as a culture of encounter, you're more likely to find a sympathetic ear, and I think people on the culture of distinctiveness side tend to frame people on the culture of encounter side as enemies in a culture war, but that's not the case.
So you have just a minute or two for any final remarks, Kathleen.
Well, just a couple. Thank you for having me speak with you. I guess my main advice would be not to focus on the issue narrowly, but to see what's at stake broadly, humanly and ecclesially for all of us in this issue, because as Pope Francis says, everything is connected and we are all supposed to encounter one another. So I am an adherent of the culture of encounter. That's my preferred style. But I try to work hard to understand, to encounter people who see things differently.
Thank you so much for your engagement with us around this really challenging topic tonight.